Gifts of the Dineh by Barbara Simons, illustrated by Marla Baguetta. Page 3. The bus roared down the flat, empty Arizona highway. "When do we get to Window Rock?" complained Annie to her brother. "I never knew the Navajo reservation was so big. What are we doing out here anyway?" "You know what?" John said. He was only 2 years older, but he was using his "you're just a kid" voice. "Mom and Dad have lived in Prescott ever since they got married. They want us to learn more about the Navajo. We haven't visited our grandparents since we were really little." Page 4. "Look," Annie whined. "Nothing but dust and rocks and sagebrush. I bet grandmother and grandfather don't even have a television. They probably don't even have a car." "I know they do have horses," said John. "Anyway, it's kind of cool out here. Look at the colors and shadows on the land. It might be fun to go riding." Page 5. When the bus pulled into Window Rock, two older people were waiting. They smiled broadly when they saw John and Annie through the bus window. "Grandfather looks like kind of a cowboy," Annie whispered. "Grandmother looks like Dad." "In a good way," John added, poking her with his elbow. "Welcome, John. Welcome, Anaba," Grandmother said, hugging them both. "We are so happy to have you with us at last." Annie was surprised by the sound of her full Navajo name. John put out his hand. Then he remembered that Dad had said shaking hands wasn't a Navajo custom. He pulled his hand back again. Page 6. Annie was right. Their grandparents didn't have a car. They had a pickup instead. Annie and John squeezed into the middle of the seat. Annie made a face at John. She didn't speak, but John could tell what she was thinking. What will we do here for 2 weeks? Before long, however, the kids' curiosity took over. Buildings, streets, people's clothes, everything was so different from home. Soon they were out of town and bouncing over a rough road. Annie could see why her grandparents drove a truck. "Where is everybody?" she wondered aloud. "I thought thousands of people lived on the reservation." "They do," answered Grandfather. "We just don't like to live too close together. In the old days, each family lived in a hogan with other family members nearby. They raised sheep and moved a lot. Many families still live far away from any town, without electricity." Noticing the kids' puzzled looks, he explained. "A hogan is the traditional Navajo home. Look, there's a really old one over there." Grandfather pointed. "It's a small, round, one-room house made of mud. Newer hogans are built with logs, but all of them have a smoke hole in the ceiling." "A smoke hole?" Annie asked. "Sure," Grandfather said, "so the smoke can go out. In a hogan, you make a fire in the middle of the room." Annie shuddered. One smoky room? No electricity? This trip might be even worse than she expected. Page 9. Grandmother smiled, amused by Annie's concern. "Most people live in ordinary houses or mobile homes," she said. "We live in a small community. We have schools and churches and a general store." Annie sighed with relief when she and John arrived at their grandparents' house. It was small, but it was a typical house. It even had a television antenna. John was excited to see the corral and several horses. Behind the house was a small hogan that Grandmother said was for ceremonies. Grandfather and Grandmother carried the kids' luggage into the house. Annie and John followed. The house was filled with wonderful aromas. John and Annie realized how hungry they were. Grandmother went into the kitchen to finish cooking dinner, while Grandfather showed them where they would sleep. Soon John and Annie were gobbling down unfamiliar but delicious foods. tasty mutton stew, cooked greens, and fry bread with honey. Page 10. The next morning, Annie awoke to strange noises, muffled thumping sounds. She tiptoed quietly to the doorway of the next room. Grandmother was sitting on her knees on a pillow in front of a loom. Her hands moved quickly from left to right, drawing colored yarns in sections across the upright threads. Then her hands moved from left to right again, beating down each section of weaving with a tool like a heavy wooden comb. The beater made the thumping sound. For a few minutes, Grandmother didn't notice Annie. She was quiet, and her thoughts seemed far away. When she turned, she said, "Oh, there you are, Annaba. I hardly heard you." Then she explained, "When you weave a rug, you use your whole self. You think about patterns and colors and what your fingers are doing. You remember the traditions? Gifts from all the grandmothers. It's as though the pictures in your mind flow right through your fingers." Page 11. "What will you do with the rug when you're finished?" Annie asked. "Oh, I'll sell it, probably to tourists at the visitor center," Grandmother replied. "But when a rug like that is so special, how can you sell it?" Annie asked. "There is satisfaction in making something both beautiful and useful," Grandmother answered. "You honor the gift of weaving by doing it well. Besides, weaving earns a good living for us." Page 12. From a back room came the sound of running feet. John appeared in the doorway, catching his breath. "Guess what Grandfather just showed me? He's got all kinds of pictures and awards from the Navajo Nation Fair. He was a great rodeo rider. He's going to teach me." John stopped in mid-sentence when he saw the half-finished rug on the loom. "Wow, Grandmother," he said in a quiet voice. "I've seen rugs like that in museums and stores. I never knew they were made by people like you." "People like us?" Grandmother and Annie corrected him together. Grandmother smiled. Page 13. The days of John and Annie's visit flew by. They met cousins they had never seen. They explored canyons as they rode with Grandfather. They played basketball with their cousins and other kids who lived nearby. They ate meals with all kinds of relatives. Page 14. One day, Grandmother said, "We are going into town to the visitor center tomorrow. Once a month, I demonstrate weaving for the tourists. Showing off is not the Navajo way, but many of the Belegana are truly interested in our traditions." "Belegana?" asked Annie. "People who belong to a different culture, who aren't Dineh." Dineh means the people in the Navajo language. It's what we call ourselves. You and John and your parents live in the Belegana world, but your roots are here among the Dineh. Page 15. For the demonstration, Grandmother wore a long-sleeved blouse of deep purple and a long, full skirt gathered at the waist. Strands of silver and turquoise beads hung around her neck. Bracelets decorated her wrists. Not everyone wears clothes like this anymore. Grandmother whispered as they walked into the visitor center. "But people expect to see them. They are part of the tradition." "I think you look beautiful," Annie whispered back. Page 16. Annie watched with satisfaction as a group of people admired Grandmother's expert weaving. Grandmother explained to the gathering that the wool came from her cousins, Chura sheep in the mountains. She told how she had made dyes from plants, in the old way, when she was younger. Now, like most weavers, she used commercial dyes, she said. John joined Annie near the crowd of tourists. He was wearing the new belt buckle Grandfather had given him. "Do you think we can go back home soon, John?" Annie asked softly. Maybe in September, he answered, as though he had thought of it already. We could go to the fair with grandfather and learn how to weave, added Minerva, like grandmother. The end.